Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our regular UNIPS e-mobility webinar. Today we will be talking with our guest from USA. His name is Enrique Lacombe. He's the head of e-mobility of USA. He will be presenting on EBus projects and the challenges of EBus projects in Latin America and the challenges of public transport. So as our regular meetings, we're going to have time for him to present. He's going to be sharing for approximately 45 minutes. And then after that time, we're going to open up for questions that you can add at the comment section of our YouTube link or channel. So please go ahead as Enrique will be presenting. You're welcome to share your questions, your comments. We're really excited of having Enrique joining us today, and we're also really excited of how his experiences can be beneficial to all the different countries, the different institutions, the different implementing agencies and partners from UNIP. So Enrique, welcome to our session. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you very much, Juan. Good morning. Good morning to everyone. So I would just like to start off a little bit with my experience. I've been in mobility for a long time, so I don't know if that's good or bad, but I've been around for a while, and I've done a lot of stuff from all the way from high-speed rail in Europe and North America to bike sharing projects and personal vehicle sharing projects in Latin America. So also, I would just like to speak a little bit about USA. USA is a Mexican industrial group. We're a fairly large group, and we've been around for a long time. We've been around for over 80 years in Mexico. And about 4 years ago, we decided to start an electric mobility division, which I lead, and I'm very honored to do so. And we have had some successes, and we are making some progress. So just a little bit about my experience before we start. And also just one precision, Juan, my presentation is not that long. I'm going to focus it on 4 very clear topics. And I would love to hear comments and questions from the audience. I think that is much richer, because I can talk forever about this, but it's always, I think, more beneficial, and it enriches the conversation when we have comments and questions from the audience. So thank you, Juan. Thank you to PNUMA. And if there's nothing further, I think we can begin. So this is, I would just like to start with this. This is very important, and I think this sets the tone for the whole conversation. So fossil energy is a primary contributor to climate change, accounting for around 60% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. Air pollution from using hydrocarbon combustible fuels for transportation causes millions of deaths or sicknesses every year within children, young adults, and elderly, accounting for 6 out of every 10 victims. For the transportation sector, costs related to fossil fuel are a major limitation to market growth and efficiency. For these reasons, among others, Mexico and Latin America require greater access to available and proven clean energy mobility technologies. Mexico and Latin America require energy-efficient vehicles and the most advanced zero-emissions technology as currently used in developed countries. This requires a lot of investment and leadership on clean energy technology and sustainable mobility. So you will excuse me, many of my examples and of my presentation is focused on Mexico because it is the market I know the best. But I do have a little bit of experience on the rest of Latin America, so please feel free to ask any questions or to try to get those examples applied to Latin America. These are the 4 topics that we will talk about today. So as I mentioned earlier, they are very clear and focused topics. The first one is about, and let me just go back a little bit. We're talking about e-buses specifically for public transportation. So it's very, very specific for public transportation systems all over Latin America. So where to locate the charging infrastructure on route, on any given route, and we will talk about this a little bit in the next slide. How to size correctly the charging infrastructure. This is a very big challenge. I've seen this many times. The operators don't have a clear idea or a clear picture on how to size correctly their charging infrastructure. And this obviously has a very large effect on the total cost of the project, the total initial investment of the project, but also on the life cycle cost of the project. Financing, I believe anyone who's ever been in touch with an EBus project, again, specifically for public transportation, has seen that financing is the biggest challenge. And we will talk about this a little bit more on the next few slides. And then finally, post-sales warranty and battery replacement. This is also a very big challenge. This is not a challenge that we face right now. It is a challenge that we'll be facing in 3, 4, 5, 10, 12 years down the road. But it is something that we need to look at right now so that we're not surprised whenever we come back to this topic in a few years. So let's get on with it. The first topic, charging infrastructure, where to locate en route the charging infrastructure. So I draw here a very simple example of a public transport route. And this is actually an actual example from a customer that we have, not in Mexico, somewhere else in Latin America, where, as we can see, that well, there's obviously a point A of the route, which is the start of the route, and a point B, where we end the route. Now, instead of the overnight storage for the fleet being in either point A or point B, the overnight storage is basically in the middle of the route. So how do we deal with this? Well, it's quite simple in my opinion. And again, let me please be very emphatic in this. This, what I'm telling you, is my experience and my opinion. I am very open to having other people's opinions and other people's points of view here. So in my opinion, it's quite simple where we place the storage, given that the limitations of the route and of the peak hours and the down hours of the route allow this. So in this particular case, the overnight storage was, as I mentioned, right somewhere in the middle of the route. So what we did is we looked at where the electrical requirements for the charging infrastructure was the best place to be established, and it was actually at the overnight storage of the route. So what we did is we placed that infrastructure right in the middle of the route. So this makes for a somewhat atypical configuration, because instead of the buses charging in either point A at the start of the route or point B at the end of the route, they had to charge somewhere in the middle. So the timing for the peak hours and the down hours had to be very carefully managed so that they could charge actually when they needed to charge, and again, not at the heads of the route, but in the middle. The reason and why we did this, again, is because the electrical infrastructure was already in place at the customer or the operator's overnight storage. So to answer the question, where to place the charging infrastructure, I would finish up this topic like this. If the downtimes and the peak times of the operation allows it, place the charging infrastructure wherever it is easier or wherever the electrical requirements are already there. If that's at point A, point B, or at any given stop, ideally at the overnight storage, that's where you need to place them. I've seen projects where the charging infrastructure is used, for example, as the metro lines. Typically, the metro systems in the different cities already have the electrical requirements for you to place 5, 10, 12 charging stations. So it's much easier to place the charging stations wherever the electrical requirements are already there than to have to take the electrical requirements, which will typically require a lot of cabling, a lot of wiring, which is very expensive. It will also require sometimes a substation or a big transformator in order to meet the electrical requirements of the charging stations, specifically if you're charging 5, 10, 12, 20 vehicles at the same time. The charging infrastructure is really grows. So the conclusion for this point is place your charging infrastructure wherever the electrical requirement is already there, and try to use what is already there. So if there's a metro system in your city, if there's an electrical substation somewhere in your city, try to place your charging infrastructure right there where you don't have to do a big investment for the cabling. All right, moving on to the next topic. How to size the charging infrastructure correctly. This is very important. And why is this important? Because again, it is very much related to the daily operation of the operator of the customer. So more and faster charging stations translate directly into more cost. More cost at the beginning of the project, so more cost upfront, but also more cost, as we mentioned earlier, in infrastructure, in cabling, in substations, in transformators, and more cost, obviously, in utility bills. So more costs in the total life cycle cost of the project. There's going to be more cost because the more charging stations you have and the faster charging stations you have, there's going to be more cost associated with this. Here's again, and this is a real life example of a customer in Mexico. Customer wanted 120 buses, and he said he needed 60 charging stations. So one charging station for each 2 buses that needed to fully charge the bus. So from 20% of the battery capacity to 95% of the battery capacity in 2 hours simultaneously. So this is a very big infrastructure. It's a very big charging station, which will run you typically, a charging station, for those that are not familiar, will run you between 8,000 US and it can go all the way up to 20,000 US dollars, depending on what you need and how fast you need to charge it. And obviously, the faster you charge the vehicles, the more degradation you're going to have on the battery. So do you really need to charge vehicles in 1 hour? Or do you really need to charge 60 vehicles simultaneously? Probably not. And this is related, again, to your peak hours and your down hours in the actual operation. And as I'm sure everyone here is aware, the operation from Monday to Friday is quite different from the operation on Saturday and on Sunday. And also, I would never recommend having 100% of your fleet operating. Even at your tallest peak hour, I would never recommend 100% of your fleet operating. I would always, for a 120 vehicle fleet, I would always like to have at least 5 vehicles in reserve. So between 5 and 7% of your vehicles in reserve in case something fails, in case you have a flat tire, in case you have an accident, in case anything of that nature happens. So in my opinion, never have a 100% of your fleet. There's going to be times that happens when you have big peaks for public events or for national holidays or whatever is that. But in normal, regular operation, Monday to Friday, I would recommend never to have 100% of your fleet operating. So going back to the example, this customer wanted 120 buses and 60 charging stations. So we sat down with the customer and we said, do you really need 60 buses, 60 charging stations? Do you really need to charge 120 vehicles at the same time? The power requirement is going to be enormous. The investment is going to be huge. Do you really need this? Why don't you scale the thing? So why don't you charge some vehicles during your downtimes, and you can have the availability of your fleet during your uptime, during your peak hours. You don't need to have vehicles, depending on the routes, but unless your route is 200 plus kilometers, You don't need to have vehicles charged 100% at your peak hours. Maybe with vehicles that are charged at 50, 60, or 70%, you're good. And you can charge those vehicles during the down hours. So after we made all this analysis with the customer, we came to the conclusion that 20 charging stations were sufficient instead of 60. So that's 40 less charging stations. That alone represented a $360,000 savings just by on charging station. And on this does not take account wiring, it does not take account transformators, and it does not take account power and utility bills. It does not take account all the infrastructure required for this. Also, the amount of space required to park 120 buses at the same time is enormous. That's land, and that costs a lot of money. So if you can charge 40 buses simultaneously instead of 120 buses, that is big savings. So again, here my recommendation is the customer will always want whichever is most. If you, the customer or the operator, so if you do a careful analysis, you understand the project, you understand the route, you understand the peak hours and the down hours, you can reach a much better compromise. And here, just one small parenthesis, here the customer wanted to charge the 120 vehicles in 1 hour. That's not necessary. We can have charging stations that charge 40 vehicles in 4 hours, so 2 vehicles simultaneously per charging station, 2 hours, 2 hours and 2 hours, so 4 hours for the whole 40 vehicles. And that is enough. That is enough because with this and 7 vehicles in reserve, you can very efficiently operate your route, have more time on your batteries and put less strain on your batteries, so have more time on your batteries. So this concludes topic number 2. This is one of the big ones. Topic number 3, the financing. This is one of the big ones. As I mentioned before, I think anyone that has looked at EBus projects has seen that this is very, very important. It's a very big topic. It's one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest hurdles. Right now, EBuses are about twice the price of an internal combustion engine bus. So that's a fairly high amount, especially when we're talking large fleets of 100 and up buses. However, the fuel and maintenance, and the fuel is very subjective, depending on the countries, depending on the tariffs, depending on the taxes, depending on the operation, so on. Fuel costs are very variable from country to country, but as a rule of thumb, fuel and maintenance are about 1/3 of the cost of an internal combustion engine vehicle. So yes, the upfront investment is much higher. However, the fuel and maintenance are much lower. So what do we need to do? And there is no perfect formula. And I don't think there's going to be one for the near or even medium term. But what we have looked in USA, what we've seen with our customers, what we've seen that is a way of working around this is, first of all, we need to have government incentives. There's a lot of types of government incentives, from taxes, from lower taxes, to import taxes, utility taxes, and so on. So there's a lot of incentives. In this, if the operators, the manufacturers, and obviously the public opinion together go to the government, you will get some response. What kind of response, how big of a response you will get, depends on the country, depends on the pressure you've put on the government, depends on how much the government is willing to invest in electric mobility, how much the government knows about electric mobility. We've seen a lot of governments that are interested, but they don't really know how to make this work. They don't have an idea of how the buses work. They don't really know how the operators operate their vehicles and the routes. They don't understand the charging infrastructure. Many times they are afraid that with electric mobility, their right now their electric grid will have unnecessary strain on them. And also, many of the governments don't understand the benefits of zero emissions mobility. It's not a priority. So how to get the government to give you incentives? You all have to work together, put pressure on the government, show them with real numbers, with real examples in other countries. This can be Chile, this can be other countries in Europe, this can be China has a lot of buses running. Real examples of how these kinds of vehicles are an actual option. They do reduce the carbon footprint, they do reduce emissions, and of course, it's a financial model that is workable. It will take 4, 5, 6 years, but it is a workable financial model for the operator and for the government. Second key issue in this for the financing is the old internal combustion vehicle replacements. I've seen in many countries, in Mexico, it is starting to work at the moment. I'm not familiar with any other cases in Latin America, but in Europe and in Israel, for example, they do have these kind of programs where any given route is operated at the moment with internal combustion old vehicles that can be 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. So there is an incentive if you scrap those vehicles, and you can obviously demonstrate that you scrap those vehicles, the government will give you an incentive which can range from 10 to 20% of the new electric vehicle. So this is a very big incentive because for the operator, it will give them basically the down payment for any kind of leasing or credit that they need on the vehicle. So it's a very, very big incentive. And it's a very good way for the government to say or to understand that they've scrapped 100 old internal combustion engine vehicles that have been operating for whatever number of years, and they are giving the incentive to replace those vehicles with the electric, obviously zero emissions vehicle. The next topic is look into the development banks. There are several development banks. There's a German one, there's a French one, there's a British one, and I'm sure there's many more. But these banks, and in my experience, they always have to go through local banks or through local government banks, but they do have money assigned for these vehicles. It can be millions of euros, millions of dollars, and they do have a very big interest in going into these projects. They do have the funds available. The downside here is that it's going to take a long time. First of all, you need to contact them, and it's going to take you a long time to contact them and to contact the right people, because they're big banks and you don't always get to the right person at the beginning. And second, the bureaucratic processes on these are huge. So it's going to take you at least 6 months to actually get something tangible on the table, to get your customer with these guys, to get all the bureaucratic and all the red tape into place as to where these guys are ready to actually fund a project. And again, in my experience, it always goes through a local, whether that be private or government bank, but you're never going to get the money directly. It's going to go through a local bank in your country. But these guys, it's very important. These guys have the money, and they are very hungry for these kind of projects. They don't know how to approach these projects. They don't have the manpower to look at all the countries, to look at all the manufacturers, to look at all the operators. So you have to go and knock the door and present your project and sell your project and say that everything is feasible, and they will give you the money. These guys have the money and the funds available. And finally, and this is the one no one wants to hear, but it's the truth, and we cannot hide it. We need to face it and be very clear about this. The operator, be that public or private operator, the transit authority, whatever we like to call it, will have to invest more upfront. So how do you work this? Because when you tell this the operator, basically they shut down. They say, we don't have the money. I don't want to do it. I'm going to keep doing diesel buses or internal combustion engine buses. So how do you work around? Well, you work this around with the first three. So you need to find a way for the operator to at least that he knows that he is going to have to invest more, but you will help him either with the government incentive, either with the replacement of old vehicles, or either with the incentive of the development banks. I'm sure there are other mechanisms, and this is where everyone needs to get creative here, but these are the ones that we have identified that work, that are there, and that are tangible. So I guess this concludes for this topic. And finally, we're going to go on to the last topic, which is very important. And again, it's not a topic that we have to look at right now when you start a project, but it's a project that you have to be very clear on, because this will give you a headache in 6 to 10 years. So typical bus projects in Latin America, it's not the same in Europe and it's not the same in Asia, but typical projects in Latin America range anywhere from 10 to 15 years. 15 years is a lot. 10 years sounds much more reasonable, but they do range from 10 to 15 years. It's big investments, and everyone wants these vehicles to last as long as possible. So if we're going to have a vehicle that lasts 12, 13, 14, 15 years, it has to translate into one battery replacement that must be taken into account in the life cycle cost of the project. You don't want to have an operator which at year 7 or 8 has a battery that is charging less than 75, less than 80%, and you have to tell them that he's going to have to spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, to switch the batteries on his vehicles. You have to tell this upfront. Basically, and as a rule of thumb, the cost of the battery is about 45% of the cost of the original vehicle. Now, this is with the battery cost right now. What will the battery cost in 7, 8, or 9 years? No one knows. I hope someone knew, but the reality is no one knows. It's probably a fair bet to say that battery cost will go down in the next few years. How much will they go down? I wouldn't bet on that much, but it's probably fair to say that technology will get better and that we will have a better battery costs. But a rule of thumb that the customer has to know right now, it's not money that he needs right now, but it is money that he will need in 7, 8, or 9 years. He will have to replace his batteries, and that will cost him about 45% of the cost of his original vehicles, plus labor. Now, labor, we tend, especially in Latin America, to underestimate it. This is a very, very big work that we have to do. You have to put up the vehicle. The batteries are obviously very heavy. They can weigh up to 13,000 kilos. So it is big, big, big work that has to do. And also, you cannot do it all at the same time. You have to do it vehicle by vehicle, because then you have to take those vehicles out of the fleet. And obviously, none of the operators will be happy with this. So you have to do it 1, 2, or 3 vehicles at the time, and it will take some time. It will take 4, 5, 6 days, 4 if you're very fast, but more like 5 or 6 days per vehicle, and it's going to take a lot of money. So this is very important that the operator knows about this upfront, and he is prepared for this to whenever it comes. Moving on to warranty. In my experience, battery has to be at least 1/3 of the total project time. So if your project is for 15 years, you have to have motor, battery, and charging station warranty for 5 years. If you can get more, fantastic, but at least have for 1/3 of the time. And what I'm saying this is you're getting an insurance. You're ensuring that the first 1/3 of the project, you're covered with warranty. Obviously, this includes spare parts, labor, and so on. But you have to be covered on this. And this is my experience. I'm sure there's other experiences here. But in my experience, make sure you have at least 1/3 on motors, batteries, and charging stations. Spares obviously must be insured by the manufacturer. We all basically depend on Chinese suppliers. And at the moment, as we all know, it's much harder to get parts from China. It's much harder to get logistics from China, and it's much more expensive. So make sure you have parts for at least 1 year to cover warranties and to cover any unexpected um, occurrences. Your operator typically knows what he's going to break. He breaks tires. He breaks lights. He breaks doors. He typically knows what he's going to break. And whatever breaks on an internal combustion engine is probably the same thing that's going to break on an electric vehicle, operational wise. So make sure you have spares for at least 1 year in advance. And finally, and this is very important, you have to have trainings for the operator and for the technician. As an example, in Mexico, we have a vehicle that can perform on a typical route about 250 kilometers. We've had that same vehicle with an operator that was not properly trained drain the battery in 180 kilometers instead of 250 kilometers. So it's a big difference. If we train the operators correctly, the vehicles will last much longer. We will need to charge much less and therefore put less strain on the batteries, put less strain on the grid, and have less cost, utility and electricity wise. Sorry. So it's very important to train the operators correctly. And also, it's obviously very important to train the technicians correctly. And my experience, there's a very large turnaround in operators and in technicians, particularly in Latin America. So I would recommend a refresh of operators and of technicians at least once a year. If you can do it twice a year, it's much better. This does not exclude, obviously, that you have to give all your training manuals and all your operator manuals and so on. But I would take into account a certification or a refresh every year at least, both of operators and of technicians. And with this, I end my 4 topics. So I'm open to any questions or comments from the audience. Thank you very much, Juan and everyone.
Thank you, Enrique. I'm going to try to take your screen. There you go. Perfect. Thank you, Enrique, and thank you to the audience. I saw a couple of questions on the comment section, but I'll probably start with my question. So, Enrique, here at UNEP, we're sort of collaborating with both, mainly with national governments, trying them to sort of set up the ecosystem that will sort of, or the sort of legislative and sort of, or basically all the incentives that have to be in place in order to promote electric mobility, right? So from your perspective, from someone that's coming from the market, right, what are some of the key sort of incentives that need to be set in place in public transport, specifically, you know, in order to sort of incentivize for the EBus projects to happen, right? Where are some of the key elements that have to be in place, both from the national government, but also from subnational governments like cities, administrations, and all that?
Okay. I think the biggest one and the most tangible one is the getting rid of old vehicles. So for anyone getting rid of an old vehicle, of an internal combustion engine vehicle, which can be, again, 10, 12, 15 years old, they are obviously old vehicles. They're not Euro 6 or they're maybe Euro 2, and they are very expensive to operate. They are very expensive to maintain. However, they are vehicles that the operator has been using for a long time. He's used to those vehicles. He knows the vehicles. He trusts the vehicles. He has parts for the vehicles. His technicians are trained on the maintenance and the operation of those vehicles. So there is a big psychological factor for the operator to get rid of vehicles to a new technology that he doesn't know, that he's afraid of, that is much more expensive. So I think there's how to call it, maybe a propaganda is a strong term, but maybe a public campaign from the government, be that federal, local, or whatever, where we explain, we show, we even lend the vehicle to some operators. All the operators, and this is just my experience, but all the operators that we have lent the vehicles to, they they stop fearing the vehicles. They start liking the vehicles. They say, well, this is great. I'm not maintaining the vehicle. I'm not using much diesel or combustible of any type. The electricity is much lower. And on top of that, if the government is going to give me 10, 15, 20% of the initial cost of the vehicle to get rid of an old vehicle, well, that's great. So in my opinion, Juan, the biggest and the most tangible incentive would be to get rid of old vehicles and have the government to scrap the old vehicle, and have the government give you an incentive for scrapping old vehicles and replacing them with electric vehicles.
Perfect. No, that's key, Enrique. I think that's sort of seeing the whole life of the previous project to come to an end, right? And incentivize the operators to advance to newer vehicles, electric vehicles. It's definitely key. And I have a couple of questions from the audience that I'm going to start sharing now.
Sure.
But I'm going to rephrase some of them, Enrique. So we have one from Javier Garcia from Chile, and they're asking what are sort of the countries that are advancing the most in electric mobility and the ones that are falling behind. But I want to add a twist to that question. When you were talking about financing, you mentioned that it was important to share the good practices that other countries are sort of implementing and share that with the government and with the key actors in order to sort of try to replicate in the region. And you mentioned the case of Chile, for example. But so I would like to expand on not just mention the countries that are sort of these successes, but also mention why they are successful, right? So I think that would be good if you can mention some of the countries in the region and why they are successful in promoting e-mobility public transport projects.
Okay. I think that I'm not an expert in all the countries. Just please, if I say something that's not right, please bear with me. But I know the Santiago case. Santiago is, I think, the most advanced city in e-mobility in Latin America. I am a bit familiar with República Dominicana case. I know they have a large interest in. I'm not sure they've already landed any of the projects, but I have received a lot of consultations from there. They have hired very serious firms to let them do these projects. And in Mexico, there is one city, Guadalajara, which already has a fleet of 40 buses. And how they manage this I think it all comes down to the government really wanting to do this. If the government wants to do this, for whatever reasons they may have, it might be political reasons, it might be actual environmental reasons, but when the government wants to do it, it happens because the operators will align, the manufacturers will align, and obviously the public will align. Yeah. So I'm sure if there is a will from the government, and again, their motives might be whatever they are, it doesn't matter. But when the government wants to do it, be that local or federal government, it happens. So I guess that's my answer, Juan. What the biggest thing to get a project going is the will from the government.
Perfect, Enrique. Thank you. I'm going to move to another question now. So we have a question from Paraguay. So one of the operators, Renato Sucolillo, is asking, what are some of the biggest hidden costs in the move from internal engine, combustion engine buses to electric vehicle buses?
I'm going to mention one. But I would say to Renato is if you have a good partner, there should be no hidden costs. You should know, obviously, your upfront costs. You should know your everything that's going to cost you, all your warranties, your spares. You should have a list of spares, which details how many hours you need to replace so and so and so, and what is the cost of replacing so and so and so. The preventive maintenance. So what's the charge for changing the reductor oil, for changing everything that needs to be changed every 5, 10, 15, up to 100,000 kilometers. But I would say, and I mentioned this in my presentation, I think it's very important that you know that at year 7, 8, or 9, you will have to replace the whole battery. And the replacement of the whole battery is going to be roughly 45% of the vehicle plus labor, and obviously the downtime that comes with that. So you should make sure that whoever's selling you the buses and whoever's operating and so on tells you a very clear picture of that. I would probably say that, and I'm not, I wouldn't say it's a hidden cost. It's something that maybe people don't have in mind. But if you're going to use the buses more than 8 years, for sure, you're going to have to replace the battery. And that's going to cost you. So just make sure that you know that and that you save up to that. You have 7, 8 years to save up to that. You know, it's not something that you have to pay right away, but you're going to have to pay for this for sure.
Thank you, Enrique. We're going to move to another question. So one of the questions is asking what to do with batteries when their useful life ends. So if there's a second use that can happen to that battery, and maybe if there's sort of an economic sort of use as well, is there some sort of revenue that can come from that second life of the battery, or selling that battery, or anything like that?
Yes, this is a very good question. It's a very legitimate question. And in what we do, we at USA, what we do is we use secondhand batteries for other applications. The applications and the cycles in mobility are very, very deep cycles because of the power that we need to power the buses, obviously. But once the battery ends, and I'm talking about specifically, we have other projects that are not buses. We have electric motorbikes, we have electric bicycles, and so on. But what we do is we use those batteries for a storage capacity for solar projects. So and we can give them more life. We can give them 4, 5, 6 years more life with that, because the cycles in storage for wind powered and sun powered projects are not deep at all. So the batteries might not be useful for mobility purposes, but they are useful for other applications. And after their second life, we can even think about a third life, which has not been proven, in my experience, by anyone yet, but for data storage applications, which are very low powered applications, for backup of applications and so on. So I think we can extend the life of the same batteries probably 5 years after the 8 years that we use them in mobility, and probably 5 years after that. So that's a long time. And, when we get there, we'll see how we will, however, find the way to recycle all the batteries and see what we can do with that. But in, 15, 18 years from now, I'm sure there's going to be new technologies and there's going to be new ways to do stuff.
Thank you, Enrique. I have one question that I want to go back, and I'm going to twist that question as well with sort of my personal intake. So one of the questions was, what are sort of the countries that are falling behind on this issue? But I want to rephrase that question, Enrique, and place it in the context of Latin America, right? We have several like medium-sized cities where transport is perhaps semi-formal. There is a lot of optimizations and regulations that have to be set in place in public transport as we try to migrate to electric buses. But what is sort of your view on those cities, right? How do we take that challenge of sort of helping the institutions that are regulating transport to modernize and adapt and have a better sort of management of the bus services, and at the same time move towards electric mobility? And that question also comes with what are sort of the steps that have to be taken, right? Should they start with a pilot, or should they be a little bit more ambitious and have, let's say, a larger pilot of like 10, 15 buses? Or should they just start with like 1 or 2 buses? And what is sort of your view of how medium-sized cities that are sort of considering this, but they have this, so like all of these other things that have to be set in place as well?
That's a very good question. In my opinion, what they should do is have their local manufacturer, whichever that one is, or their closest manufacturer, the one they trust the most, give them a bus for 1 month, 2 months, and do a very large publicity campaign around that bus. That's probably not going to cost a lot, but do a very large campaign about the bus. So this bus is not emitting so many and so many and so many CO2 a year or a month or whatever. This bus costs less to maintain and to operate. This bus is better for the environment and therefore for your children, and so on and so on and so on. Do a very big publicity campaign around this, if possible, with the government, hand in hand with the government. If the government is not interested, this will get them interested, because they don't want to be out of this, and run the bus for 1 month, 2 months. The operator will be very happy. The operator will see and will lose the fear of changing the technology, and the public will have a large interest. They will say, well, why aren't we getting electric buses instead of the old internal combustion engine buses? So and this is probably not going to be very popular with the cities that are not there. But in my opinion, that's what works. That puts a little bit of pressure on the government. That opens their eyes. That they say, well, we have to get there. How are we going to get there?
Thank you, Enrique. Yeah, I think that's key. I think it's key to generate that sort of public eye and look at the importance of the project, and have sort of evidence and data showing the success of the story, and making that public, and reaching out to authorities in order to sell the idea and get the actors on board for the projects. And I'm going to move to, I think this is our last question from the audience, but we still have a couple more minutes. The question is asking about sort of the retrofit or converting internal engine combustion engine buses to electric buses. Is that something viable? Is that something possible? Should cities or countries consider that, or are there too many risks that we should just move straight to an e-bus that's actually manufactured as an e-bus?
I haven't seen, in my whole career, I have not seen this work. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm saying I have not seen it work. I'm sure there's very good companies out there that can do this, that can promise to do it. Is it going to cost a lot? It probably is. You're going to have to replace the whole gearbox, the whole train. Where are you going to put the batteries? If you're going to put the batteries on the roof, that's going to put a lot of strain on the frame. It's obviously going to increase your center of gravity by a lot, so it's going to destabilize the whole thing. You're going to have to place a new suspension on the bus. I have not seen it work. I've seen people try it. I've tried personally vehicles. We've tried vehicles, and in my opinion, no one has found a viable way of doing it. I'm sure there's people out there still trying. This is not the case for light vehicles. This is not the case for regular cars or even small vans. But for buses, for 8.5 meters up, I have not seen it work. I have not seen it work viably. It's expensive, and engineering wise, I would say it's not advisable. However, I'm sure there's people doing great jobs out there that I have not seen.
Perfect. Thank you, Enrique. I think that was a good response. There are several views on this topic, but I think your experience, it's important to share with the audience. Now, I do want to make a comment. I invite the audience to continue sending some questions, because we do have a couple of minutes left. But I do want to add something that is related to Enrique's presentation. Enrique today was mentioning the importance on finance, and the importance or the key, or how multilateral development banks are key in order to think about the financing these projects. And as he mentioned, this does take time, right? That was one of the things that Enrique pointed out, that it does take time, and that actors have to reach out to these institutions. As part of our work at MOVE, we are implementing a Green Climate Fund technical cooperation. We're working with 14 countries in the region, and we are supporting the countries to sort of design projects that can be competitive to a multilateral to obtaining multilateral development bank funding. So we are working currently with the countries to aid them in that process. But the Green Climate Fund has already approved 450 million program with the Inter-American Development Bank for e-mobility in Latin America. That just happened recently in July. And there are 9 countries of the region that are going to be benefiting from this. I do want the sort of audience to be in touch and to be aware of this in case they belong to one of the countries that are beneficiaries of this project. So we're going to be sharing the link to that program in our chat so that you guys can access that and maybe reach out to the actors that are sort of in touch with multilateral development funding to see how to access that finance and what are sort of the projects that are um, uh, being considered for that funding. But yeah, I do want to sort of invite again the audience to share any questions that they may have. Um, and well, Enrique, I do want to then finish with one last questions from our team from Mole then. Um, as you see sort of the future of e-mobility in the region, and you're seeing the advances in e-mobility and in bus technology, what is sort of your view on what is going to happen in the market in the future? Are buses going to sort of continue to decrease sort of the cost as we have seen in the past, or because of demand this is sort of just going to be maintained? How is sort of that initial investment that we see sometimes as the main challenge going to change, right? That infra investment that you mentioned that is higher right now, is that going to continue to be the case, or are there predictions of that changing? And in case that's not changing, maybe repeating some of the ways that we can uh, move forward despite that barrier.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that the prices will come down. With all technologies, it's happened. It's inevitable they will come down. I don't think it's going to happen in the short term. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 5 years. It will come down somewhat, 5-10%, but the initial cost will still be high. Um, eventually, eventually we will get to, but eventually it's going to take a long time. We will get to a place where electric buses specifically, and probably electric vehicles in general, will be on par with internal combustion engine vehicles. And the biggest way, in my opinion, to do this is, and this is a very radical solution, but for local or federal governments to ban the sales of internal combustion engine vehicles. So California has done this. They were very brave to do this. And it's not a long way from now. It's less than 10 years from now. And I think that's the way to do it. The cost of the vehicle coming down, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot of sales for the manufacturers. It's going to take a lot of technology development. And this also takes us to another problem that we're going to have to build a lot more batteries. And batteries might get more expensive because of the minerals involved in building those batteries. So it will happen, yeah. I don't see it happening in the next 5 years.
Perfect. Thank you, Enrique. I do have to agree with you. I think that's key to talk about the disincentives that have to be in place, and not only the incentives, right? Not only the carrot, but also the stick that we need to move forward with e-mobility. And I think it's key to set up that regulatory framework that will sort of, help us advance and really move forward and leave behind all the externalities from internal combustion engines. And I don't think it's radical. I think that we have to, as the UN, we talk that we have a planetary crisis, and one of them is we have three planetary crises, and one of them is climate change, and we do have to be acting accordingly. And because of the circumstances that we're living, it's definitely key to start taking those actions and set up those kind of policies in place as soon as possible. So thank you, Enrique, very much for your presence in this space. It was great to hear all the wisdom, as you mentioned, that we need as we plan for e-buses in Latin America, and to plan wisely. And I do appreciate all the wisdom that you share with us today. And hopefully we can continue inviting you for future events or activities with UNEP. It will be a pleasure for us to host you and to host USA with us.
Anytime, Juan. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everyone. And glad to hear from anyone that has any questions in the future.
Thank you, Enrique. I just want to give a quick reminder to our audience. We're going to be sharing the presentation from Enrique in our mobile website, so that will be available for you. And this webinar will also be hosted on our YouTube channel under the same link that you're already accessing. And it will also be placed in our mobile platform. So thank you very much.